Speaker.
I call Alistair Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last speaker was obviously a little confused, a little bit concerned. She thought that the levies relating to ACC were related to the budget surplus or deficit or the books. And this is exactly why this legislation is being put in place, to remove confusion, to increase the transparency, to increase the governance and strengthen the framework under which ACC levies are calculated, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, it's necessary because as an employer myself, I get bills from ACC, and it's often not explained. It's difficult to work out where they come from and why the increase or the decrease has come about. This bill will increase the transparency and understanding for employers. Mr. Speaker, the bill will improve the governance around the levy structure, and this is so that we can continue to have fully funded accounts. Most of the accounts are almost fully funded, and that's a good thing because it reduces the volatility in the levy setting rather than year to year, and some of the confusion comes about from a year-to-year levy setting or finalising. As we heard in the Select Committee just recently, there was a strong debate on how the levies were calculated, whether they should be higher or lower. And as I say, Mr. Speaker, a very good reason to bring this legislation through. Now, the government doesn't always go with the ACC recommendations. ACC recommended much bigger increases, in fact, in 2010-11 and again in 11-12. And had we accepted those increases, that would have cost the levy payer $630 million more. We chose not to accept those recommendations. And again, Mr. Speaker, the reason for this legislation is to make it clear what the parameters are, what the levy setting characteristics or prerequisites have to be before levies can be changed. And that's again important for the employer because again, employers are budgeting for their businesses. They need to know their costs. They need to look ahead and understand what the costs of ACC, what the costs of having staff will be. And ACC, particularly in businesses where there is a higher risk of injury, are significant, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to clarify that injury prevention investment by ACC has increased by $10 million. So that is some of the stuff that ACC is doing in injury prevention. Mr. Speaker, there's also rather not so much a parallel piece of legislation, but health and safety law reform is going through the House as we speak. Again, that is, if we can get that right, and we encourage people to take greater responsibility for their own health and safety, again, we will have less injuries, less long-term injuries, and less deaths in the workplace, Mr. Speaker. We know that New Zealand does not have a great record when it comes to health and safety, and so that piece of legislation will aid and encourage and support businesses and individuals to protect themselves and their families in the workplace. And that can only be good for, again, putting more pressure on a lowering of ACC levies, simply because there'll be less injuries in the workplace. Mr. Speaker, there's another piece of this legislation which relates to the residual levies. So they're at the moment, Mr. Speaker, it's a bit of a tidy up, I guess, because at the moment those levies must continue to be collected until 2019. This piece of legislation allows those levies to be cancelled or rescinded or discontinued at an earlier date. So when that liability diminishes, so the liability to the government or to ACC diminishes, and that can be terminated prior to the 2019 cut-off or the current cut-off date of 2019. So that's a good thing. Mr. Speaker, another example of working. Well, I just want to make a couple of points around the volatility of these funds and why it's important to consider and understand these fully funded assets. The current asset base of the ACC is over $30 billion. That's bigger than this government superannuation, or the affectionately known as the Cullen Fund, which is around 26 odd billion. So we're talking big numbers here, Mr. Speaker. And that has risen from 2009, where it was 10 billion. So that fully funding program, and we're just about there, has created this nest egg, if you like. But with the swings and roundabouts of interest rates, with we know, and as the Minister mentioned herself, a $3 billion swing on a 1-month interest rate variation is huge. So you can see the need to think well ahead of just this year to set your levies. You cannot say, well, we're down 10%, we need to increase the levies to recover the $3 billion loss that's just as a result of the interest rate fluctuation. That would be ludicrous. That would be unaccepted by the general public and the ACC levy payers. So, Mr. Speaker, this governance and this governance framework will ensure that consideration is given to the long-term view, the long-term understanding of the marketplace, the interest rates, the term structure of interest rates, as well as things that are going on in the public arena. And I've mentioned health and safety law reform. That's just one thing. We're going to have safer cars, for example, Mr. Speaker. Again, all these things in the long term will reduce accidents. We continue to invest in speed reduction, in alcohol and drug and driving, drinking and driving programs. All these things, Mr. Speaker, continue to educate the public and continue to reduce the burden that is the responsibility of ACC. So, Mr. Speaker, that long-term approach is what is required. Currently, as we've already heard from the other side, there is this debate, this argument about a misunderstanding of how levies are calculated. And that's not good. That is not a good thing. And that is why this legislation is here to support the transparency and the increased or the strengthening framework of the legislation, so that people can plan ahead, so that there can be discussion, that there can be transparency. And Mr. Speaker, that is why I'm pleased to support this piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, we've already heard of the $500 million planned reduction in ACC levies over the next few years, and that will continue. We've talked about the reduction in the car levy, the motor vehicle levy. That's a good thing. We will continue to see improvements in reductions in levies as those assets are managed in a more financially responsible manner. And, Mr. Speaker, we will have increased transparency so there is less confusion about how the money is raised, where the money is spent, where the money is invested, and there will not be the confusion that is exhibited, at least from one speaker on the other side. Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.